Simbin was a young scholar who failed the exams, and like most, he spent his day drinking the disappointment away, drunkenly rambling about his world views. A warrior approached him and decided to write his biography, immortalizing his battles, which kickstarted his new journey as a warrior scribe. The story begins with our MC, a scholar who writes, focusing on grinding the inkstone to produce more ink. After preparing the ink, he gets into position to start writing, all the while wondering if he never met that man and never recorded his life in martial arts. Would his life turn out to be different? While thinking of all of this, memories of early morning practice and confrontations flood his mind. But to get a better understanding of our MC, let's take it from the top. Like many great stories, our MC started in the most mundane places, at a small inn located at the entrance of Homan Mountain. Back then, he already had a lot to drink, groaning and rambling about the water flow in Changlong and how he should wash his feet. Meanwhile, the inn's owner sits a few tables behind him, with the warrior sitting with his back to him. For now, the store owner is thinking about how this young man is a scholar who failed the national exams is drinking his sorrows away. Meanwhile, our MC's got his head slumped at the table, brows furrowed as he talked about how he can't believe things like that happen at the government official's exam office. And by that, he meant about how they favor those who have connections in high places or when they can offer them large sums of money. We get you, man. Money and connections make the world go round after all. Pouring himself another drink, our MC proclaims that those two factors are why the world is going to rot, finding it hard to believe that the waters back there were spoiled to the core as he downed his drink in one go. By now, the inn's owner is starting to get pissed, reprimanding him that he should keep quiet if he wants to continue drinking. But like every drunk out there, our MC just got louder, slamming his hand hard on the table because he couldn't believe how everything had gone wrong. Now the local owner has his eyes zeroed in on him, fearing that he may break something sooner than later, but he's more concerned with the quiet, muscular man on the other end. The old man thought that dealing with this drunken scholar was nothing but the real deal. One punch from him, and his humble shop would be destroyed. The other man in the shop was a tall, burly man with a sword attached to his back. Even though he was not flexing it, the muscles on his arms were bulging as he drank quietly, while the old man wondered if it would be all right. Plus, the shop owner's eyes were also drawn to the stranger's sword that's a little too big for comfort. And yes, they'll be in big trouble if this stranger starts swinging it around if he gets angry later. But the old man's attention shifted back to our drunken scholar, who started rambling nonsense again, this time saying that the world is drunk and that he's the only one sober. This time, the old man stood from his seat, obviously distressed, and silently prayed for this young man to get it together and stop causing a scene. This time, our MC has his head thrown back, eyes still closed as he was reminded of someone telling him to stop babbling nonsense unless he wants to be bludgeoned to death. Being reminded of this now, he wondered aloud if this is something a government official should even say, and further wondered if it's right for people to twist the arms of others just because they have someone strong on their side. Unknown to him, the other man a few tables from behind him has been listening closely to his ramblings and is now listening more intently to what he has to say. But our MC's pretty busy with his monologue, slumping his head against the table, complaining about how rotten the world is and how something appears to have never happened if no one knows about it. Gotta love alcohol, it either brings out the confidence in you or the philosopher in you. With our MC's head still slumped on the table, he didn't notice that the muscular man had already stood up and was approaching his table. All the shop owners stared at him in panic, horrified by what was about to happen and thinking that trouble's bound to happen after all. The big, tough guy continues to approach our MC, who is now sitting with his head hanging low. As the former glares at him, he then asks if he just said that if no one saw it, then it's the same as if it never happened. But before the younger man could answer, the man already had his hand outstretched, ready to grab our MC by the collar and tell him they should talk for a bit. The little shop owner is now shaking on his feet, believing that the former is about to pop the young scholar's head off. But surprisingly, the older of the two just grabbed our MC by the scholar, saying that he needs to sober up first. Well, that was unexpected. The old shop owner stared at them, mouth agape, as the bulky man carried the other in his arm, straight out of the shop's door. And that's when it hit the shop owner. Those two haven't even paid for their drinks yet, but he could only stand there, mouthing that they should pay for their drinks as he stared at the open door of his shop. Cut to the next scene, there was a flurry of images, mostly greens, until it dawned on our MC that what he's actually seeing are the tops of the trees. What duh? And there goes his drunkenness. He woke up with a shout, scared and dizzy from being so high up and realizing late that he was actually being carried by someone. He yelled, "Stop," but the man holding him was pretty chill. asking if he had sobered up yet before landing on a nearby cliff and taking off again, jumping higher than before. Our MC could only hold still, frozen in place as his mouth hung open by the dizzying height, only for them to settle on another nearby cliff. Still shocked at the sudden turn of events, the man beside him spoke and told him that he was glad the scholar had finally come, before pulling him up by the collar again and telling him that he almost threw him over the waterfall, making our MC flail. Since they were already at the body of water, our MC took the time to wash his face to freshen himself up, and as soon as he was done, he turned to his companion. While wearing a scowl, he told the older man that what he did was rude and that it was not right for him to pull something like this, even if he was the elder. With his arms crossed, the older man remarked that his temper was still sharp, making our MC raise his voice in anger. This time, it was evident that he was pissed, especially being called out for having a sharp temper, so he used this tone to the older man, asking him what his reason for bringing him out here was. Before his companion could reply, our MC added that what the older man just did was against imperial law, and at the mention of that, the other turned to him in a frown, asking about how our MC complained earlier about the unfairness of the world. Without missing a beat, he followed up on why the younger man had the guts to bring up imperial law when the world was unfair, using his word against his. Our MC was taken aback by his reply, as he should, because suddenly, the older man emitted a powerful aura, leaving the younger standing frozen. He broke into a cold sweat, wondering why the older man's clothes were flapping when there wasn't a single gust of wind blowing. He suddenly huffed, drawing his fists together before unleashing a punch that swerved from our MC's face right into the boulder next to him. Debris flew everywhere while our MC stood frozen both in fear and shock as the older man told him with a glare that if he was a real man, then it would be right to take on the world using his real strength. As for our MC, it finally dawned on him that the man standing right in front of him was not your average man. He just failed to realize it out of drunkenness from the start. Our MC then cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure as he asked the man in front of him what he needed him for and for what reason he was brought here. Still wearing a glare, the older man just told him that he brought him there because he was drunk, and for his reason. He said that he had something to ask of him. He looked down on our MC, asking what the younger meant when he said, "If no one knows about it, then it's as if it never happened." The latter was taken aback by the question, but our MC answered that it's exactly what he said about how if no one knows about something, then it would seem as if it never happened. To elaborate further, this time he was the one who asked the older man if he heard about the saying, "The path to Cheongsa is bright," then proceeded to explain that it's something written about the history of Cheongsa in the bamboo records. According to him, officials record everything without being influenced by emotions or biases, so if it weren't for them, then they would have never known about the events that happened in the past. In a way, he also said that they wouldn't be able to know what happened if not for the literary scholar who had been loyal to the cause. Before wrapping it up and repeating his initial claim, whatever isn't recorded is lost and buried. He then added that, like ink and parchment paper, the things recorded in Cheongsa are known to future generations. The man was quiet before agreeing to what he said, seeming to better understand what the younger said, saying that records become truth and whatever isn't written becomes forgotten. The older man, with his still narrowed eyes, turned to our MC and said that what he just said was a surprising truth, which only made the latter more wary of him. Now that he explained his claim, our MC was about to go on his merry way when the older man finally introduced himself as Sejah Hyuk, fists held in greeting, making the younger man turn to him in surprise. This time, our MC bowed and introduced himself as Sun Bin, his family name being Sun, with his fists also in a greeting position, when suddenly, the older man shouted his name, startling our MC as he looked at the older man. Bin saw Jahyuk pointing at him and saying that he'd be writing a book, leaving the former puzzled. He was just about to ask what book when the older man broke into a grin, saying that from now on, he will be writing about everything he does, basically, everything about Jahyuk, and turning it into a book. While that was unexpected, an older, bulkier man asking someone to write a book about himself. Jahyuk continued and told him that with the help of Bin writing about him, other people would know that someone like Jahyuk lived and knew his deeds while our MC still stood frozen. When he opened his mouth, there was a tone of incredulity in him as he asked the older man if what he was asking of him was to write his biography, making Jahyuk chuckle, pleased with the suggestion. He even already thought of a title for his book, Sejah Hyuk, but then took it back and thought of a better one. The biography of the hero Sejah Hyuk, thinking about how the latter sounds better, while our MC moved a step back from the older man. Bin raised one brow, asking Jae-hyuk if he was still drunk, but the latter only answered by saying how he liked Bin's sharp temperament. Furthermore, he heard about how the ink strokes should have a bit of energy to make the writing even more energetic. But there's a catch, and before he said it, he took a rock from the ground before telling Bin that if he ever tried to run his mouth again without thinking, crushing the stone with his bare hand, he'd crush the younger's kneecaps just like he did with the rock, smiling as he said so. Of course, Bin could only nod his head, trembling on his feet at the dangerous man in front of him. There's nothing like the threat of brute force to get someone to agree with you, am I right? Later that night, back at the inn, the shop owner was already settled in bed, his brows still furrowed as he remembered the two men from earlier who forgot to pay for their drinks. Just then, he heard a noise just outside his front door, making him furrow his brows further at the thought of someone at his door. As soon as he opened it, what welcomed him was the sight of the bulkier man from earlier, along with the young scholar attached to his hip, unmoving and silent, as he told the older man that they'd like to stay for the night. Jae-hyuk pulled the younger one up front, putting his hand over his head and somewhat forcing him to bow in apology, while the older one said that they would also like to pay for what they ate earlier. Even though he found the situation weird, the old man didn't ask any more questions and let the two take a room in his establishment. Business is business after all. Much later that night, Bin was lying on his bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, when suddenly his eyes darted to the door. He got up slowly and quietly, making his exit, and as he reached the hall, the wall to his right exploded, throwing him off balance and making him land on the floor. As the dust and debris settled, Jae-hyuk appeared from the other side, telling Bin that it was useless and asking the young scholar if he really thought he could escape from him in the middle of the night. Bin was still on the floor, struggling to get up, and as soon as he did, he faced the older man, raising his voice and asking him in return if he really thought that everyone would listen to what he said just because he was stronger than them. Instead of answering his question, Jae-hyuk huffed, finding it hard to believe the guts of this guy. Bin, on the other hand, told him that this was his only means of escape, especially since it was painfully obvious that he had no strength of his own. Jae-hyuk called him off for his cowardly excuse, then proceeded to ask if he would be satisfied if the older man gave him a good reason. But like the scholar that he is, Bin answered in figures of speech, telling the older man that even saints went into hiding to keep away from danger. So for him, he doesn't find it shameful to bow his head for short periods. This time, Jae-hyuk kneeled beside him, leaning his face closer to the younger as he told him that what he said wasn't true because, for him, one who bows their head once will only learn to bow their head again. And for him, those kinds of people are obsequious, to which Bin replied and told him not to insult people like that so carelessly. Rather than retort, the older man got up and told Bin that he seemed to be misunderstanding something, that the younger man could leave his side. With his back turned to the scholar, Jae-hyuk told him that once he made a decision, he would never be swayed, and Bin could never run away from him. This got the other pretty riled up, raising his voice and telling Jae-hyuk how arrogant he was, thinking he was someone important, but the older man cut him off, telling him that he was welcome to try and run away. This got Bin's anger to die down, brows furrowing while the older man told him that he was daring the other to leave his side. Bin seems to have a hard time understanding what the other wants him to do, so Jae-hyuk tells him that for the next 4 days, the older man will stay in the inn while Bin does his best to run away and hide from him. The young scholar only gave him a scowl at the challenge he was suggesting, but Jae-hyuk ignored him, continuing that Bin could even ask for help or appeal to the imperial court, ask a retired master, or even a large sect, whatever his options may be. But Jae-hyuk turned back, shooting daggers at him as he told Bin that he needed to keep one thing in mind. He would come and find him after 4 days had passed, while the younger man only stared at him wordlessly. When the sun shone the next day, Bin ate his breakfast in silence, sitting at one table, while Jae-hyuk sat a few tables behind him, also eating wordlessly. Yesterday was already weird enough, but today's way weirder, with the inn owner looking back and forth at the two men eating silently. He just couldn't believe it. Last night, these two threw punches and destroyed his furniture, but now they act like nothing happened, making him wonder just what happened between the two. Suddenly, Bin got up and thanked the shop owner for the food, telling him that it was more delicious than yesterday's food. He got his bag and extended his hand to give his payment to the older man, but the latter waved it off, telling him that the bill was already taken care of by the other man last night. Bin was shocked, grabbing the shop owner's hand in his as he asked him why he would allow the man to pay for somebody else's sleeping quarters and meal. He also told the shop owner that the man behind him would also be staying in the inn for the next 4 days, while Jaehyuk paid him no mind, still slurping his soup. With one final glance at the Jaehyuk, Bin started marching toward the door in a huff, slamming it once he got outside, while the shop owner stared wordlessly, not knowing what just happened. Bin continued walking for a good little while, the little inn still a little distance from him, before he decided to break out into a run. I mean, I would too, if I were him. So, back to our MC, he continued running, wondering why he had to experience something like that just because of some crazy bastard before casting it aside and deciding to push through with his plan to cross over the Homan Mountains. Despite beads of sweat forming on his forehead and panting heavily, Bin continued to run, thinking he needed to get on a carriage first as he planned to head to a nearby village and proceed to the next one before heading to the big city. It doesn't matter where, he just needs to be somewhere where there are a lot of people. Bin thinks that by doing this, Jaehyuk will have difficulty finding him. And speaking of Jaehyuk, the older man kept his word, still at the inn and drinking his tea, while musing to himself how it's been a while since he found something interesting. Back to Bin. Our man managed to find a nearby town where, as luck would have it, a carriage was just about to set off. The driver had already whipped the horses and was about to go if it weren't for Bin calling out to them to wait for him. The driver turned to the young man, who was clearly out of breath, asking him if the carriage would be going to a big city. The carriage driver only frowned at him and answered with a question, asking him if he stopped them without even knowing where it was headed before informing the former that the carriage was bound for Muhan. Following it up with another question about whether our hero wants to hop in or not, Bin answered that he was a little too loud for comfort, and in no time at all, the carriage set off. Soon, the other passengers started talking to each other to pass the time, and one of them asked if it was the other traveler's first time in Muhan. Another one answered, saying that Muhan is a really good place, and they're famous for their Yellow Crane Tower, one of the 3 great towers in Gangnam with a magnificent view of the Jiang River at the top. Another man added that on one of the walls there are writings of Li Beck, which he recommends visiting. On to the next topic, another passenger from Bin's row commented how he looked like a peddler and asked about the current state of business in Muhan. The other guy replied that it's hard work everywhere they go, but the former countered that Muhan has a lot of people, and many more come to the said city. This time, the peddler answered that wealthier businessmen wouldn't stand by to watch their competitors silently and cited that the Namgung family, one of the 5 great families in the city, has a great presence there. According to him, the Namgung family joined hands with large guilds and monopolized the whole city market. And there's also the fact that the government officials of Muhan are all part of the esteemed family. So yeah, they're old, money-rich people with all the right connections in all the right places. Meanwhile, Ben listened silently as the other passengers continued to talk, but he couldn't help but frown at the thought of Murim experts joining hands with merchants. For one, it's because he believes that they only concern themselves in the martial arts world. But then again, he decided to let the thought pass and opted to sleep instead as their carriage rode into the sunset. The next day, their carriage arrived in Muhan, and true to what his co-passenger said, the city was filled with a lot of people. Even the docks were pretty loaded as people haul in one cargo after the other. As for Bin, he decided to shack in a rundown inn, thinking about how he initially planned to hole himself in it for the next 4 days. Well, that plan went down the drain. No thanks to Muhan's hot climate. And don't get him started about the small, noisy, and smelly inn he's in. No pun is intended. Bin thought that even if Jaehyuk was a Murim expert, he couldn't be that good that he find him here in Muhan, right? And since he already made it all the way to Muhan, our hero decided to take a look around instead of holing up in his room. One of the places he visited is the famed Yellow Crane Tower, and just like what his co-passenger said to them yesterday, it really had the most majestic view of the Jiang River as well as the whole city. Leaning on the rails, Bin admired the view, convinced that this building deserved to be hailed as one of the 3 great towers. Looking at it like this, the young scholar felt nostalgic and remembered how, in the past, he read one of Li Beck's poems and thought about how nice it would be if he could visit the Yellow Crane Tower at least once. And now that he's here, Bin never thought that he'd get to go to this place under such circumstances. After a moment's silence, he broke out into a poem, "My old friend, as I leave the Yellow Crane Tower. So do this wine I drink as spring blossoms in March, the boat that slowly disappears into the horizon." But before he could continue, a loud voice called out to him, breaking him out of his reverie. As Bin turned to look, an older man, dressed in fine robes, had his arms crossed with a scowl on his face, as he told the scholar to shut up for a bit while his two lady companions looked on. He continued to glare at Bin, obviously annoyed, and told our MC that he wasn't the only one at the place, and Bin was quick to apologize for disturbing them. However, he also told the man off, saying he was a bit harsh, making the latter angrier, and one of his companions told our hero to drop it. As for the older man, this time he looks as if he's ready to jump Bin, daring him to repeat what he just said earlier. Oh, it looks like someone forgot to attend their anger management class again. Bin just looked at the man, surprised at how the other got even angrier. But he calmly repeated what he said about the man being harsh, with the latter facepalming himself. He couldn't believe a pipsqueak like him really dared to do so. But Bin was firm on his stand, even telling the guy that he's obviously a noble based on his clothing alone, so he should act like one. But the latter cut him off, and that's when our hero realized that the man he's speaking to is actually a martial artist, as evidenced by the sword hanging on his hip. The man saw the way Bin looked at his sword, and for that, he flashed a grin before telling the latter that he needed to be responsible for the trouble he just caused. At the mention of that, one of the noble's companions, the dark-haired lady with a fan, talked to him and said that there was nothing wrong with what the scholar said, and that's when the noble raised his voice and addressed her as young Lady Gongsun. Instead of feeling scared by how he addressed her, Lady Gongsun only smiled and said that the scholar may look rough on the outside, but he was able to recite the old poem beautifully, which further suggests that if someone like him gives advice, then it's advice worth listening to. This time, the older man is pretty mad, just as Lady Gongsun told him that he should understand that he isn't as literate as most, all the while leaving Bin in a dire state of panic as the lady worsens the situation. With a firm but quiet voice, the noble told the lady that she would regret saying that to him, before turning to Bin and saying to the other that he would have to take responsibility. Our hero took a step back, obviously scared, as he asked what responsibility the man was talking about, and the latter told him that it was the responsibility of shaming a person of the Namgung family in front of others. With his hand already on his sword, the nobleman told Bin that he would take his tongue and arm as payment. This time, it was the man's other companion who intervened, urging him to stop behaving in such a way in front of a weak student, and even adding that what he would do would not benefit him or his family. With narrowed eyes and a hand still holding the sword, the nobleman addressed her as Miss Moyan, telling her that he would be the one who decided what would benefit him and the Namgung family. As he said this, he drew his sword slowly from its scabbard, all the while saying aloud how he would take the scholar's tongue and show the world that no one should ever dare speak against the Namgung family. Ooh, scary. It's pretty scary if you're the one receiving such a threat. Now the first thing our MC could think of is a curse word that rhymes with hit. Still, our man stood his ground and told the nobleman to stop it, claiming that what he was doing was against imperial law. But just like earlier, Bin's reasoning fell on deaf ears as the man told him that he would be the one to decide, not the imperial law, and even claimed that our scholar was the one who threatened him first. This got Bin pretty frustrated, asking when he did such a thing, but the man from Namgung was hellbent on pinning the blame on Bin, and everyone present would agree to his wishes. And that's when Bin knew he was screwed. Poor guy, while the nobleman elicited a sinister smile as he told him that he should blame it on his own tongue. The latter raised his sword to strike Bin, telling him that a rash mouth would always cause anger to rise. Right before his sword came into contact with our MC, there was a loud clang, and before he knew it, the nobleman got thrown back and was quick to ask who intervened in the fight. One who answered is a woman, standing in front of Bin, as she told the nobleman that she's no one worthy to be of note, but it's also a name she wishes not to tell the likes of him. Chivalry is not dead after all. The girls are the ones doing the saving now. Everyone got really quiet when they heard what the lady said, and nobody dared to move a muscle. Of course, it was the nobleman who broke the silence, shouting at her for not being ashamed of revealing her own identity, then demanding to know her name and family in this instant. The lady said she would oblige if only he had the qualifications, all the while changing her stance to be ready for his attack. As expected, the nobleman's really not having it, and if he was angrier then, even more so now. With a tight grip on his sword, he asked the lady how dare she butt into the Namgung family's business, vowing to make her regret this. Instead of being intimidated, the lady swordsman even taunted him, saying that he was welcome to try, and that was the final straw that broke the camel's back. He made a break for her, calling her names, and in a swift movement, he thrust his sword toward her, but the lady swordsman parried it, making his sword fly back. With a safe distance between them, the nobleman tried to hide how badly his hand was shaking due to the force earlier, while the bystanders could only stare in awe. Bin was confused at what just happened, while Lady Moyang was also taken aback, seeing how the two only clashed once, yet the young master Namgong was pushed back. The nobleman had a hard time processing what happened as well, staring hard at his shaking hand and panting when the lady's swordsman lunged at him, blowing his sword back again. The man could only glare, helpless, as she continued executing one attack after another until he finally got disarmed. Without his sword, the nobleman could only cradle his trembling hand. The lady swordsman stands over him, her blade toward him, as she tells him that his sword will unleash its master's temperament, and since the master is shameless, the sword can't help but also be so. With that, she returned her sword to its scabbard and turned to Bin, suggesting that they should leave now. The scholar was surprised but quickly obliged, leaving the nobleman still kneeling on the floor, not before shouting at them that this ain't over. Bin flinched when he heard that, but the lady calmly replied that this was something they could both agree on since a rash mouth would always cause anger to rise, feeding him the exact words he said before and rendering the nobleman silent and defeated. That's one sick burn. As soon as they got out of Yellow Crane Tower, Bin was quick to issue his thanks to his savior, bowing his head in gratitude even though the lady's swordsman told him that there was no need to show an excessive expression of gratitude. But Bin insists, highlighting the fact that if she didn't intervene, then he wouldn't have gotten out of there safely, and adding that this was something she deserved. But the lady had her eyes averted and was about to say something else but decided against it because, in reality, she just mistook him for someone else. Instead of saying this aloud, she decided to keep quiet and was about to ask something else. The Bin ready to answer, but she also decided to forego her question. This time, she told him that he should be careful because there's no guarantee that he'll be safe next time, highlighting the fact that Murim is a world where the sword is the law. She also suggested to him that he try not to get mixed up with Murim warriors, and Bin could only hang his head low in shame. He knew that she was right, though in his case, he never expected the noble man from before to pull his sword out like that in a public place. Bowing to her again, Bin told her that he'd keep her words in mind, and the lady swordsman said that she'd be taking her leave. But just as she was walking away, our MC called out to her again and introduced himself as Sun Bin before asking if she would give him the honor of knowing her name. Like she told the nobleman earlier, she just told him that she's no one important and hoped that he wouldn't take it personally. Still, Bin was about to counter-argue, so eventually she gave in and told our MC that he could just call her Kong Ha Su Yun. Repeating her name in his mind, Bin wondered if she meant Mist of the River, but by then, she was already walking away from him. He wondered if the reason she told him earlier not to take it to heart was because she would disappear like a mist, but in the end, he concluded that he never knew people like that existed. Since he parted ways with Kong Ha Su Yun, Bin decided to head back as well to grab something to eat. He settled for a local restaurant full of men drinking among themselves while he sat by himself, quietly eating his dinner. He stared at the now empty bowl in front of him, thinking about how many of these tasteless noodles he had eaten, and he was rubbing his belly, the exhaustion of the day finally seeping in. Suddenly, the door to the restaurant slid open, with a group of men already on the lookout for a certain someone. Many of the people at the restaurants turned their heads and gasped upon seeing who they were. It was the members of the Namgung family. One of the men, a grumpy-looking one, asked the other, a timid-looking man, if they were in the right place, and the latter said that they were. Just then, the timid-looking man pointed at Bin, while everyone else in his vicinity scurried away like rats. Our scholar got even more confused, asking the man why he was pointing at him when their group started approaching him without a word. One of them kicked the chair at his table, prompting Bin to stand as the man asked if he was the one who did it. With his initial question still not answered, Bin asked what they were talking about, and this time, one of them finally answered in the form of another question. Was he the rude bastard that was rude to their young master at the Yellow Crane Tower? Our MC somewhat expected the earlier incident to come back and bite him in the butt, though it's better to deal with the current situation. He told the man that what he was accusing him of wasn't true. And as he was about to tell his side of the story, the image of Kong Ha Su Yun appeared in his mind, making him wonder why this was happening even after he got help. He gritted his teeth and told them that he had argued with their young master earlier, but he also pointed out that their young master was the first to pull a sword on him and threaten him with it. In his defense, Bin told them that he only called their young master out for his rude behavior. The man only stared at Bin in reply before smirking and asking him where the lady swordsman was. Our MC answered truthfully, telling him that he didn't know, and the other man motioned for his men to take him all while saying that he'd give Bin more time to think. Two men quickly took our MC by force, and our leader shouted at him that they were taking him back by force. What's more, They even threatened him that they'd take good care of a rude bastard like him, which made the scholar do his best to break free from their grip. As per his usual catchphrase, he asked them how they could do something like this under imperial law, but one of his captors just looked down on him and smirked as he told Bin that he knew guys like him get really quiet with just a punch on the face, nearing his fist on the latter's face. Just then, another voice sounded from behind, responding to one of Bin's captors as he told them he also knew how guys liked him pretty well. This made all of them turn back to look in the direction of the voice. It was Ja-hyuk himself. Just like a hero arriving in the nick of time, Ja-hyuk tells the former how exactly guys with no real skills act, while Bin could only fumble with his words. As per the leader of the group, he got anxious and wondered how he managed to get there when he couldn't even sense his presence. But rather than show his distress, he asked the Mirim fighter who he was. Ja-hyuk was still defiant, telling him that he didn't feel like introducing himself to their likes, though he did take a firm stance. The leader of the trio got angry at what he said, this time raising his voice as he asked Ja-hyuk if he didn't care what happened to him and warned him to leave them be unless he wanted to get messy with the Namgung family. At the mention of the Namgung family, a dark aura started emitting from Ja-hyuk, rolling their name on his tongue, until he finally remembered them, evoking a chilling grin from this Mirim fighter. This time, his aura was fully unleashed as he glared at the trio, telling them that they were wrong if they really thought that the mere mention of the family name would scare him. As soon as Ja-hyuk unleashed his aura, wisps of purple smoke crawled toward them, and soon enough, both of Bin's captors stood shaking, their skins turning purple before they fell face flat on the floor. What in the shadow imitation technique was that? Because of this, the leader was left trembling by himself, his hand on his scabbard, ready to draw his sword, but Ja-hyuk spoke first, echoing what the young master of Namgung said, "A rash mouth will always cause anger to rise." The leader of the trio stood frozen, trembling badly, just as Ja-hyuk was ready to swing his fist at him if not for Bin holding him back and telling him to stop. This made the older man narrow his eyes at our MC, reminding him how these men tried to take him away before asking him if he had any idea of what they would have done to him if he had been brought to the Namgung family. Bin didn't answer and instead pointed out that if he did kill them, then he was no better than them, making Ja-hyuk furrow his brows at him for his strange way of thinking. So he decided to take a different approach and ask our scholar if a lion would become a rabbit after killing it, rendering both men silent once the question was aired. Instead of answering the question, Bin told the older man that he should just stop, and this time, Ja-hyuk asked him if he would do what he said if he did what our MC asked. Our MC let go of the Mirim fighter's hand, and with a firm stance, he told him that he wouldn't, but if the older man respects his wishes, then he will do his part and listen to his side of the story. That was enough for Ja-hyuk, who released his hold on the two men, and in no time at all, they got up and turned their backs on the two. But before they could walk out fully, their leader told them that the Namgung family wouldn't forget this, slamming the door as they left. Ja-hyuk only chuckled, telling Bin that it would be really funny if their family had actually said that to his face. And now, turning to him, he asked Bin if they should go for a walk. Cut to the next scene, it's already nighttime, and we're back to the little old inn at Homan Mountain. As for the little old shop owner, he's now lying in bed, thinking about how he could finally get some peace now that the bandit-like man has left his little establishment. But no sooner had he thought this than a sound came from the front door, and what welcomed him was the intimidating sight of Ja-hyuk, with Bin smiling reluctantly at his side. Well, so much for peace. With the light of the lamp illuminating his face, Ja-hyuk looked scarier as he told the older man that they couldn't forget the taste of wine at this place, rendering the latter speechless at their sudden appearance. Fast forward to a little while later, and Bin and Ja-hyuk found themselves sitting at the inn's familiar table, with food and drinks already prepared. The innkeeper left the two just as Bin started pouring alcohol on the older man and asking how he managed to find him. Ja-hyuk took a sip and answered that it was not hard to find him, and this time, Bin told him that he was just someone who used to study as a scribe and was no one compared to a master like Ja-hyuk. That being said, he asked the older man what kind of help he could offer him. Ja-hyuk became serious, putting down his cup as he told the younger man that he was starting his Bimu journey, something unfamiliar to the other, which is why he echoed the term. The older man explained that Bimu is a fight to the death among Mirim warriors and that all of his opponents are not only strong, but they also have a powerful influence. But for someone like that, those things don't faze him, as he intends to kill those he will face in his Bimu. Bin spoke and asked him how he would fight if his opponents were that powerful, but instead of answering him directly, the older man questioned the scholar if he knew about the 4 stars of Mirim. When Bin said no, the older man began to explain it, beginning with Murim, a world where there are influential sects and great families. Among these sects and families are the greatest masters called the Four Stars of Murim, and usually, these masters don't involve themselves in Murim politics. The said masters only have a single goal in mind, to destroy their opponents and reach a higher stage. Bin kept quiet, listening intently to what Jahyuk had to say, but in his mind, he found this story pretty incredible, since it was as if it was born out of legends. Continuing with what he was saying, Jahyuk said that he's more than happy to allow it if his opponent would exercise a bit of influence in their fight, since he's confident that he will not only defeat them, but also destroy their existence. The only thing he can stand, though, is that it will be said that nothing ever happened. Bin was confused, echoing what Jahyuk said, and that's when the latter repeated what Bin said the first night they met. If no one knows about it, it's as if it never happened. This was what the Murim fighter meant, and Bin somewhat understood what he was trying to say, but he voiced it out so that they were on the same page. He asked the older man if what he wants Bin to do is to make it so that the people he kills won't wipe out his existence, or have it so they make it out, so he becomes a villain. The older man quietly agreed, leaning his head on his hand as he told Bin that whatever is recorded becomes truth, and whatever isn't becomes lost. Turning to him, he told Bin that he was the one who said that, and the scholar hung his head, admitting that he was right. Bin also added that this is a world where people will believe a deer is a horse if he says so, when suddenly, Jahyuk reached for his hand and told him that it was that very reason why he needs our MC. The older man told him that he would be coming with him from now on, and that he wanted Bin to write a book about everything he will do, and why he did it. With a serious look and holding both of Bin's hands in his, the older man added that he wanted him to do that so that this Murim fighter's actions would never be forgotten. Our MC was speechless, and then reasoned that he didn't know anything about the world of Murim or martial arts. At that, the older man told him that there was no need for him to worry about it since he had him, emphasizing this statement by putting his hand over his chest with a grin. By this time, Bin already has his mouth agape, thinking about how much this man really believes that he could do this. He also thought that he owed Jahyuk, and there was no point even in going home since he failed the exam. After a moment, he decided to agree with Jahyuk's wishes, telling the older man that he try to do it. Our hero is once again dutifully grinding the inkstone to produce ink before preparing to write. He began by quoting the Chinese philosopher Confucius: "A benevolent man will have no worries, a wise man will not be deceived, and a courageous man will not be afraid." As Bin completed writing it down, he said that this was Confucius' path and on our MC's side. It made him wonder which of the three he was not doing, brooding over the matter. The next day, it was all bright and sunny, with the bluest of skies present. But Bin couldn't care any less about how beautiful the day was because he was too busy catching his breath. Today, Jahyuk took him for a stroll uphill, with Bin lagging and holding onto the nearest tree for support. Still catching his breath, he wondered how Jahyuk could walk tirelessly like that with his sword hanging behind his back. After a little while, they stopped to get a breather, and the younger man quickly had his water break. As soon as he was finished drinking, Jahyuk told him that his physique was weak, but the former countered that how could he even think of comparing his physique to that of a Murim warrior like himself. That being said, our MC also asked him if he was not out of breath at all, a question that the Murim fighter echoed back to him, and Bin answered in his mind how pretty obvious it was that he was out of breath. When Jahyuk spoke, he explained that the reason he got out of breath so easily was because his breathing was shallow. He elaborated further by telling the younger that if his breathing is shallow, his movements will falter, and if that happens, he will lose his flow. As a result of losing his flow, Jahyuk points out that it will make Bin tend to rethink everything, which makes everything more difficult. This prompted Bin to ask the older man what he should do in that situation, and Jahyuk said that he must never lose his focus and take steady steps without stopping. While he was telling this to Bin, Jahyuk had his eyes closed, breathing deeply, so when he turned to look at his companion, he was puzzled as to why Bin was writing something in his notebook. The younger man explained that he was writing it down and that he intended to write down all his deeds and words to put them together into a book later. Jahyuk didn't comment on that, but he did praise our scholar for having amazing penmanship. For the first time since their meeting, Bin held his head high as he told Jahyuk that his penmanship is something he can boast about even if his physical state may not amount to much. He further added that he studied writing for over a decade, so this was at least something he should be good at, smiling sheepishly as he asked for the older man's approval. Jahyuk told him no, and that the thing he was praising was actually how the younger man uses his hand. leaving the latter staring at him. Ja-hyuk further elaborated on what he said by telling the other that there is no hesitation when he stops and starts writing, and he does not lose the intricacy of the lettering even when he gives strength to the brush. He'd wrapped it up by saying that his flow was amazing, while Bin could only stare at his hand, surprised at how many details the older man noticed about his writing. It was sundown when the duo returned to the little inn near Homan Mountain, and as soon as Bin reached his room, he flopped face first on the bed and didn't move from there. He thought about how he couldn't move a single muscle after walking for a whole day. And just like the rest of us, our man's also thinking about washing up and changing his clothes only to fall asleep a second later. See, totally relatable. It was late at night when Bin felt a presence in his room, and when he woke up startled, he met Ja-hyuk with a shocked look while the other looked at him calmly and told him not to panic. Still groggy from sleep, the younger man was busy wiping the drool off his face when he asked the Miram fighter if there was something he needed from him in the dead of night. And in response to his question, Ja-hyuk grinned and told him that they should go out since the moon looked fantastic that night. Soon enough, the two men found themselves traveling the same beaten path, with Ja-hyuk in the lead and Bin close to his heel, feeling cozy wrapped up in a blanket. Suddenly, Ja-hyuk stopped in his tracks, prompting our MC to stop as well, and that's when the Miram fighter grabbed his sword and raised it to the night sky without saying another word. Bin looked at him curiously, wondering what he was going to do with his sword, and he couldn't help but notice that the more he stared at the blade, the weirder it looked. Just then, wisps of white light started emanating from the blade, catching Bin's attention, which made him focus more on what was taking place. As soon as it did, Ja-hyuk executed a vertical slash with a force so powerful that a gust of wind accompanied the blade as it swung, which he quickly followed with a horizontal swing, a ray of light shadowing the sword's path. Ja-hyuk cut through the fallen leaves while Bin stared in awe until he finally regained his awareness and scrambled for his notebook and ink. He thought to himself that he must record this, while Ja-hyuk continued to execute one move after the other, showcasing various stances. As the scholar looked at the fighter, the former realized in defeat that he couldn't actually record this, just as he saw Ja-hyuk's form being silhouetted by the glow of the moon. It didn't take long for the older man to finish his exhibition, and as he did, he turned to Bin and asked if he saw it, the wise heaven's sword arts, while also introducing his sword, the Moonlight Blade. With his head bowed, Bin told Ja-hyuk that he saw all of it. He admitted to the older man that he dared not say that he was able to see it clearly. Ja-hyuk only narrowed his eyes at him in response before suggesting to the scholar that they should head back. The next day, the two traversed the same path from last night, and they walked in silence for a long while until the sun had almost set, with Bin walking much further from the older man than before. It was late when Ja-hyuk broke the silence and told Bin that he looked like he had something to say. And at this, the younger man raised his head and asked him if it was okay for someone like him to see the sword art that he showed last night. Based on what he heard, the warriors of Muir never show their art to others, but Ja-hyuk assured him that there's a lot more that he wants to show Bin if he wishes to see them all. In addition to that, Ja-hyuk also told him that Bin may have already realized that he did not fully understand what he saw last night, prompting him to ask the younger man if he knew the meaning behind Ja-hyuk's swings and how one movement could have many meanings. Furthermore, the Miran fighter remarked that masters can determine the outcome of a battle just by discerning one's hesitation in their pupils. If one does not understand every single meaning in each movement, then one clearly hasn't seen it, making Bin hang his head low, deep in thought. Weighing the words Ja-hyuk said, Bin admitted that the older man was right, since they're already opening up to each other. Ja-hyuk also told him that the reason the scholar has no energy right now is because he's hungry, and as if on cue, Bin's stomach let out a loud growl. Instead of returning to their little inn, the two decided to forego it and opt for a different restaurant. Bin was the first to enter, drawing the curtains back as he was welcomed with the sight of a full house, all the tables filled. He thought to himself that it'd be hard to find a table for themselves, so he tried calling one of the servers, the latter with his hands full of dirty dishes. As expected, the server told him to wait for a moment, so the scholar could only give a sheepish smile just as Ja-hyuk emerged, asking what he was standing around for. As soon as his voice sounded, everybody in the room turned their attention to them, and this time, another employee approached them, and Ja-hyuk spent no time telling him what they wanted, the best dish, as well as tea and wine for the both of them, to which the employee obliged with glee. As soon as he left, Bin mused about how working in this establishment would be pretty exhausting, scouring the surroundings as he said so. He based this comment on the mere observation that all kinds of people would be here, ranging from noble ladies to intimidating Murin warriors and even high-ranking government officials. This time, he told Ja-hyuk that for workers not to kick up a fuss later on, they need to gauge and figure out who the other people are. If the customer was someone calm, then they could make them wait for a little while. But if they're like a temperamental Murin warrior, then they should be served quickly. Upon hearing Bin's last sentence, Ja-hyuk turned to the younger man, asking as he pointed to himself if he looked like a temperamental Murin warrior. But instead of answering him directly, Bin was more surprised that the Murin fighter was unaware of how intimidating he looked, rather than feel offended or anything. Ja-hyuk calmly sipped his tea as he told Bin that he was thinking too much. His only comment is that if the waiter is busy, that they could just make the customers wait for a little while. In reply to that, Bin asked him if he could afford to wait a little while if he was in the same position, thinking that this older man looked like the type who's never been ignored before. Surprisingly, Ja-hyuk responded that he would wait since he can't make something that isn't there, and he's not the kind of person who concerns himself with the attitude of employees. Plus, he said that all he needs to do is fix their habit if he finds them a little rude, putting down his cup of tea as he said so. If anything, what's more concerning for this older man or other people, turning serious as he told Bin, who could only reply in puzzlement at what he said. Unknown to Bin, his companion was looking at the table way further from them, where 4 people were seated, 2 men and 2 women. Bin looked in the direction Ja-hyuk was looking and saw that the people at the table were also looking back at them. So this time Bin told him that their lot didn't look like Murin warriors, but the latter mentioned that he never said that he was concerned with Murin warriors. Meanwhile, at the other table, one of the men there, the one with the dark hair tied into a bun, turned to one of the ladies seated and told her that both Bin and Ja-hyuk were looking at them. The lady seemed pretty nonchalant about it, and this time, the younger woman spoke with caution as she told her companions that the one carrying a pitch-black-looking blade was notable, wondering aloud if they had an idea of who he was. This time, it was the other younger guy, who answered and mentioned that Lee Hosen of the Sumseo Castle carries a large blade as well, at least according to records. Finally, it was the lady's turn to talk, and from the looks of it, she seemed to be a noblewoman. She told the younger man that he was probably not Lee Hosen because she highly doubted the man they were all looking at was listed in the Baekhin records, especially one carrying a blade as large and amazing as that. Just then, the younger lady told her that both Bin and Ja-hyuk kept looking at them and asked what they needed to do if these 2 were actually assassins sent after them. Her fellow lady companion only gave an amused reply, pointing out that if they were really assassins, then they were being too obvious by staring at them so hard like that. This time, it was the other nobleman who spoke up and told everyone at the table that the man carrying the black blade had tremendous ki energy, to the point that he may be a high-ranking person from the Mubang sect or part of the Shaolin monks in disguise. Just an FYI, the Mubang sect is a group of Murin warriors who are considered outcasts from other groups. And Shaolin, well, you know what Shaolin is already. Now, back to the story. When they heard their companion's description of Ja-hyuk's ki, a sudden seriousness fell to their table. Even the noblewoman's brows furrowed, and the other lady grew even more anxious. As if to prove his point, the nobleman decided to test his claim and emitted a ki, sloshing his tea in the process. But no sooner had he directed it to Ja-hyuk than the latter turned his attention to him and flexed his own ki back to their table, shattering the nobleman's teacup in the process. The nobleman could only look at the broken item in his hand. The drink spilled as he commented on how terrifying it was. His 3 other companions at the table were waiting for his judgment, while at the other table, Ja-hyuk smiled to himself and said that he was looking forward to it. The nobleman then spoke up and told everyone at the table how Ja-hyuk just sent a tremendous ki in his direction, whereas he only sent his ki to pass through. And the result of such an exchange was Ja-hyuk destroying his teacup. The younger man at the table frowned, telling him that he didn't feel anything, as well as the younger lady, and that's when the noblewoman got what he was trying to say, suggesting that the Murin fighter directed his ki to her companion only, in a room full of people. She couldn't believe such a thing was possible, and now she wonders aloud just what kind of monster he was. This time, she turns to the nobleman and asks him if he thinks he can win against the other, and the former admits dreadfully that he's not sure. This time, they turn their attention to Bin, who was too busy and excited about the food that just arrived at their table. She asked him what he thought of the scribe, and the nobleman told her that he looked normal, judging by his looks alone, but he thought it was pretty suspicious to see them traveling together. The lady seemed to be satisfied with his answer, so she gave a little smile before informing everyone that they'd spend the night here. Obviously, she was met with a lot of untoward reactions, with the younger man telling her that it would be dangerous since not only did Ja-hyuk show hostility toward them, but there were a lot of unknown factors at play as well. At what he said, she told him that the two were the ones at fault since they were the ones who provoked them first, and ignoring provocation is not really her style. I don't know about you guys, but these guys seem to have the story twisted. They're the ones who set Key first. Duh. Meanwhile, Bin is a little too happy munching on their food, with Ja-hyuk sitting quietly opposite him. Sure, color these two men as danger. Later that night, Bin was sitting quietly by his small table, his pen and notebook spread in front of him, when suddenly, Ja-hyuk appeared in his room, asking if he was not sleeping yet. The scholar smiled and told the older man that he was, but he ended up waking since he had a feeling that the latter would come knocking on his door tonight as well. And just like the previous nights, the two proceeded to walk down that same path, with Ja-hyuk in the lead and Bin following close as the latter carried with him his small table. As he tried to keep up with the Miran fighter, Bin asked his companion if he needed to do his training every night in the middle of the night. He was only met with silence, and a little while later, Ja-hyuk stopped walking. So the younger man took this as a cue to settle on the side. Reading his writing materials, Ja-hyuk still had his back turned to the scholar, whereas Bin was wondering how many lines he would be able to write tonight. He also thought that the Miran warrior was pretty remarkable, something he noticed long before, and he even compared the older man to a tall mountain and river. Suddenly, Ja-hyuk spoke and voiced that it was about time they should come out. Confused at what he said, Bin wondered what he was talking about, but Ja-hyuk continued talking and said that if they needed more time to gather determination, that he was more than happy to give them that. As soon as he finished speaking, the noble man from before finally appeared, emerging from the bushes. He then raised his fist in greeting, apologizing to Ja-hyuk for his rude behavior. The older man was quick to brush it off, saying he was not being rude at all, before pointing out another part of the bushes, asking why they were still hiding and if they really thought that they could hide right next to the noble man. This time, it was the noble woman from before, accompanied by the younger man, as she replied and told Ja-hyuk that she wasn't sure if she'd be disturbing him. For a group larger in number, they sure like using sneaky tactics. Meanwhile, Bin's eyes widened in shock, pointing at them as he finally recognized who they were. They were from the restaurant earlier. Ja-hyuk, on the other hand, only had his eyes narrowed as he told the people before him that he had already warned them. As he said that, he extended his right arm behind him with his palms stretched out as he tried to reach out for something while Bin looked at him curiously. All of a sudden, he made a gripping motion using an invisible force, and as he did, out came the young lady, the last of their visitors' companions. Bin was shocked at the young woman who fell face first behind him, wondering aloud how a person could appear from out of nowhere, but Ja-hyuk only looked down at her. With a sharp look, he told her that he didn't care if their group was traveling in disguise or if they were trying to keep a low profile, but he drew the line at her hiding in a place like that. The younger woman glared back at him in turn, and as soon as she got up, she took her place behind the noblewoman as the latter smiled and apologized again for offending Ja-hyuk. She added that the younger woman, whose name was Manga, was only doing her duty, which is why she hid behind Bin. The noblewoman further added that it was the only thing she could do, facing the Scribe, since fighting a daegyup like Ja-hyuk is something she couldn't do by herself. A little FYI here again, guys. A daegyup is like a respected title given to those related to martial arts. Another term for this could be martial master, though this title is related to those having moral ideologies. So back to the story, Ja-hyuk didn't like being called daegyup, so he flat out told the noblewoman not to call him that, especially since he doesn't give a crap about things like moral ideology. Furthermore, he also said to her that she's pretty similar to someone he doesn't like, making the noblewoman giggle as she told him that she'd take it as a compliment. Since he's a man who means business, Ja-hyuk asked them if they were finally ready to test him out, but instead of the noblewoman, it was the older guy who answered this time. Raising his hand in greeting, he bowed as he introduced himself as Wee Gajin, and Ja-hyuk told his name in turn, arms still crossed over his chest. Gajin told him that it was an honor for him to be able to cross blades with Ja-hyuk, but the latter only drew his blade. The Miran fighter told the younger man that it would be better for them both and their blades if they ditched any hypocritical words and just got on with it. Finally, someone said it, "We want some action." In reply, Gajin procured his sword, but before he drew it, he told the older man that what he said were not words of hypocrisy since it was his genuine impression of him and his vow to not hold back in their fight. With that, he starts to draw his sword from the scabbard, while Bin, who has been observing from the side all this time, is starting to panic. Our MC could feel the adrenaline in his veins since he never thought that the first Bimu would suddenly appear out of nowhere like this. Just then, he heard a voice call out to him in his head, breaking him out of his line of thought. It was Jahyuk. The Miram fighter advised him to calm his emotions and observe the flow, as well as not to give in to the flashiness of the fight. He also told our MC that the road would not be seen by those who do not wish to see it. What all Bin could think of was how he could send all of these messages into his mind. Still, the older man was not done with his instructions, wrapping it up by saying Bin should just look at him. With his last words, the scholar became in awe of the older man in front of him. Smiling as he found the former to be someone who has unwavering confidence, he's the same as ever. Soon enough, Gajin took his stance and, in a blink of an eye, jumped high with his sword drawn back, readying for a thrust, while Jahyuk held his blade before him, ready for defense. Their blades clashed, resulting in a force so strong that it produced air pressure in their area. Gajin was gritting his teeth from the force, unlike Jahyuk, who remained impassive and looked on just as he swung the moonlight blade horizontally, which forced the other to jump back and out of the way. The Miram fighter swung his sword back, but the younger one managed to evade it, despite being in midair. And this time, it was Gajin who decided to unleash an attack with a downward slash. Jahyuk read his move and was quick to counter it with a diagonal slash, only for Gajin to step on the older man's blade to move back. The younger fighter used this chance to regain his footing while Jahyuk silently looked at him, waiting for the former's next move. Meanwhile, Bin could only hang his mouth open, his hand suspended in mid-air with his brush, as he thought about how he could not afford to look away from the fight for even just a second. With that, we're wrapping up the first part of the series. Would Jahyuk emerge victorious and unscathed from this fight,